I see that at the very start we're already up to 30 participants. That is a really nice number, and while I say this, it's still going up, going up. So we might have a few more joiners once we've started. I also see that we have people from all sides of the ocean. That's really good too. The APARSEN webinar of today has the topic of certification of digital preservation repositories. It is by now the 7th webinar that the APARSEN project is organizing, and the goal and purpose of these webinars is to share in a very early stage the first results of our APARSEN project. And before we jump into the program of today, I would like to arrange a few logistical matters with everybody. The first one is that the bandwidth of this mega meeting program is restricted, so therefore I would like to ask everybody to keep video images off unless you're a speaker, and also to keep your microphone shut if you're not posing a question or engaging in the discussion. That keeps the bandwidth, that keeps a bit more capacity on the bandwidth available for doing the webinar itself. We have 5 speakers today. Simon Lambert, as our APARSEN project coordinator, will give a short introduction how certification fits the project. Then we have Ingrid Diller of the Dutch Data Archive, and she will tell us more about the Data Seal of Approval approach DANS has launched a few years ago. Sabine Schrimpf of the German National Library will explain the DIN Nestor approach for certification. And then we have Barbara Sierman of the Royal Library in the Netherlands, who's been very involved in the ISO approach for certification. Last but not least, David Geretta, the APARSEN project manager, will explain how Project APARSEN tries to bring all these 3 approaches together in a strong approach. Because it's very important that people don't think they have to choose between these 3, because these 3 actually build on each other. Okay, I think we are ready for the first presentation. I would like to ask Marion Massol, if she's there, to shut her video screen. That will make it a bit easier. Right now, I would like to give the floor to Simon and Simon Lambert to explain how certification fits the APARSEN project.
Yes, thank
Simon,
you,
please show us your slides.
Yeah, so I'm going to be operating the slides, not only but the other speakers. So what you should see in a moment or two is the first of my slides. Right, just a second. Right, how's that? Can you see my first slide, my title page?
No, the screen is black.
Aha, right, sorry, I may have chosen the wrong application. Let me try again. Okay, how's that? Can you see my my title now?
Yes.
Good.
Very good.
Great. Okay, that's fine. So yeah, I'm going to be giving a brief introduction to APARSEN and to this webinar on certification. So I'm Simon Lambert from the Scientific Computing Department at Science and Technology Facilities Council in the UK. And I'm the administrative coordinator of the APARSEN project. APARSEN is a large network of excellence in the area of digital preservation, and it's partly funded by the European Commission under one of their research programs in the field of digital libraries and digital preservation. The project is a large one. It has 31 partners altogether, and it's 4 years in duration, and we're just about to enter the fourth year, the fourth and final year of the project's lifetime. So we're becoming very active with our webinars and other dissemination activities recently and over the year to come as we present our results. APARSEN, it's what is a network of excellence? Well, it's a grouping of organisations that come together in a particular field, and in the case of APARSEN, our aim really is to defragment the effort that is being directed to the problems of digital preservation. And what makes APARSEN very special, I think, is the very broad scope that it has. Broad in terms of application domains, that is to say the type of digital material that we're considering, from the holdings of libraries and memory institutions to scientific data, a wide range of aspects of the problem, both technical and non-technical, and also a variety of different approaches and techniques. If you attended any of the previous webinars, you have heard, for example, about approaches to interoperability of systems with reference to digital preservation, or about persistent identifiers. We've also been working on cost modelling, on preservation services, on storage solutions. So the partners bring a wide range of expertise and knowledge that we're using, we hope, to defragment the landscape of digital preservation. And ultimately the goal is, during the last year of the project, to set up a virtual centre of excellence in digital preservation, which will be founded on a common vision that we're establishing at the moment. So the approach of the project, we've divided digital preservation up into 4 topics, which are these ones along the top of the diagram here: trust, sustainability, usability, and access. This is just a convenient way of considering the different aspects of digital preservation. Of course, today's webinar on certification of repositories falls within the topic of trust. How do you trust a repository to do a good job? And then within those 4 topics, we have 4 streams of work reflecting the different nature of the problems being tackled and the work being done. And the results of our work in the form of project reports and documents are all visible on the project's public web page, of course. So onto certification in particular. Why is it necessary or desirable? Well, it addresses some of the threats to the long-term access and usability of digital data. Of course, these are not only technical issues such as format obsolescence or durability of media, but there are organizational human issues as well. And these arise because digital material has to be held somewhere. So let's say it's held in a repository of some kind. I mean, there can be many different kinds of repository, many different scales, levels of was put rather bluntly, that the one we trust to look after the digital holdings is down. So you may come back to your repository in a few years' time and find that in fact the data is gone. It's no longer accessible. What can we do about that? How can we counter that threat? Well, one answer is some kind of certification of repositories, certification to give confidence that the repository is doing a good job, is doing the right things in preserving its holdings. And certification can be implemented through audit. So asking questions about what the repository is doing and evaluating the answers. Needless to say, we also want confidence in the audit process itself. And this is where standards come in, because standards can help us to achieve a completeness of coverage. That is, we're checking everything that's relevant to the performance of the repository, and to some extent, to the extent that it's reasonably possible, the standards can help us with the uniformity of assessment. So we're not simply leaving things to the judgment of the auditor, although that's important, but we're giving some guidance. And here's an example from the ISO CCSDS standard on audit and certification of trustworthy digital repositories. What we see here is one of called metrics, that is the criteria against which repository will be judged. And this one is saying that the repository shall have in place an active professional development program that provides staff with skills and expertise development opportunities. So there's some supporting text explaining why that is considered necessary. There are some examples of how a repository can show that this criterion is being met. So does it have professional development plans and reports, training requirements and budgets, etc. So what you can see is that this is giving guidance to an auditor about what sort of thing to look for when assessing a repository. It's not giving an absolute, but it's giving guidance to allow a degree of uniformity and trust, basically, in the process. So, for example, a repository which was unable to produce any evidence of an active professional development program, well, that's not a very good sign. So that's it's guidance for the auditors, really. Some questions, general issues in audit and certification, which I think some of these are going to be addressed by the later speakers. What is the scope of the audit? How complete does it need to be? What coverage of repositories functions should it entail? Who performs the audit? Can it be done internally, or is it better to have external auditors? Is there a simple pass-fail assessment, or rather some more complex system of recommendations? When should it be repeated? Because a repository which has good practices in 1 year may have fallen short in 5 years' time. How much does it cost, of course? So what we're going to hear about in the following talks is various standards that make up the European alternatives, but rather complementary aspects of the same approach. And so with that, I'm going to conclude my own presentation, unless there are any questions or observations at this point, before I hand over to the next speaker, Ingrid Dillo from Dans in the Netherlands.
Okay, thank you very much, Simon. Let's check with the people in the audience whether anybody has a general question on Simon's introduction. Otherwise, we shall go on to Ingrid. I don't see anybody stepping up. Also not in the chat box. If anybody has a question, please feel free to do that in the chat box. And in the meanwhile, I see that Simon has put up the slides of Ingrid. Again, if you want to have a good view of them, you have to click the little box under the slides which says fit to screen. Then you will get it in the right size on your screen. And Ingrid Dillo will tell us more about the data seal of approval, which was introduced by Dans a few years ago. And as I had a preview of the slides, I know that already 22 organizations around the world have complied to the data seal of approval. So Ingrid, please tell us more about it.
Thank you very much, Eefke. In the next 15 minutes, I would like to introduce to you the data seal of approval, which, as you have already heard, is really the basic step in the European framework for certification, the basic standard. And I hope to answer in my presentation the 5 questions or issues raised on the last slide of Simon, and answer most of your questions. Something goes wrong here. Okay, next slide, please. First, a few words about the key characteristics of DSA. DSA has 16 guidelines for trusted digital repository. And the majority of these guidelines are related to the data repository itself. But a number of them are related to the data producers and to the data consumers. DSA is based on a self-assessment, so this means that there are no external auditors involved and there is no site visit in the review process. The review process is supervised by the board of DSA, and DSA is granted for a period of maximum 2 years. There is an online assessment, an online tool available for the self-assessment and also for the review process. Next slide. A bit of history then. Like Evke said, DSA was initiated by DANS in the Netherlands, and first the idea was that we should set up a national seal, a national data kernel. We started work on this in 2005, and in 2007 the first version was presented. But then after a few years we realized at DANS that the impact of DSA would be much greater if it would be internationalized, and so we handed it over to an international board, and now it is part of the framework for audit and certification of digital repositories. Next slide. What do we want to achieve with the DSA? We hope that DSA provides data producers the assurance that their data will be stored for a long time in a reliable way. It also wants to give the funding bodies the confidence that the data that they funded will be available for reuse. And finally, it will enable data consumers, we hope, to assess the repositories so that they can be sure that the data that they use from a repository are trustworthy. Next slide. And we defined a number of high-level principles, you could say, that we think are very important within DSA. And these are that the data should be available on the internet, that they should be accessible, of course, while taking into account the relevant legislation with regard to personal information and IPR. The data should be usable in the appropriate file formats, should be reliable, and finally they should be citable so that people can refer to them in a persistent manner. Next slide. So once again, the stakeholders in DSA. First, the data producers, who are responsible for the, you could say, the scientific quality of the digital data. The data repository itself, responsible for the quality of storage and the availability of the data. And finally, the data consumer, who is responsible for the quality of use of the digital data. Next slide. So the focus of DSA is, you could say, on the repository as an enabler of good data producer and data consumer practices. This means that the repository has to meet the 10 guidelines directly related to the repository, but it should also make it possible for producers and consumers of data to adhere to the other guidelines. And if all this is in place, the data seal is given and it can be displayed by the repository on the repository website. Next slide. A few words about compliance. DSA has minimum levels of compliance for each separate guideline, and these minimum levels must be met to receive the DSA. But these compliance levels are not written in stone. They are regularly evaluated, and we expect them also to increase because we expect best practices in this area to emerge. We expect that compliant tools become available, and also, of course, that implementation occurs. So for us, it is a continuous work in progress. Next slide. On the next slide, you can see the different compliance levels running from 0 to 4. From not applicable to this guideline has been fully implemented for the needs of our and all the steps in between. The compliance levels at the moment for the 16 guidelines are only on the levels 3 and 4. So either implementation phase or full implementation already achieved. Next slide. Filling out your compliance level is of course not enough. We also ask evidence for this from the repositories. And with this evidence, we think that transparency is very important. And therefore, we ask the repositories that their compliance levels link also to publicly available documentation. And if this is not available, we ask them for a deadline for public release of this documentation. Furthermore, of course, we prefer the documentation to be available in English. But in practice, we see that a lot of documents are in the national languages, and then we ask for a short summary in English. Next slide. With respect to the peer reviewers, we also have guidance material for them. They have to review the self-assessment, and they have to ask themselves questions like, does the self-assessment response correspond to the guideline? Are links to supporting documentations available publicly? And do you, of course, agree with the self-assessed compliance levels? And are they sufficient to award the DSA for this guideline, etc., etc.? And for us, it's very important that in responding to self-assessments, the reviewers try to provide helpful comments more than asking specific questions. We really want to give guidance to the repositories and be inclusive. Next slide. I will now show you 3 slides or 4 slides with the text of the guidelines on them. I don't have time to go through all of them, but you can read them afterward when the slides become available. I just pick out a few words. The first 3 guidelines are aimed at the data producers. They have to supply sufficient information around the data. They have to supply the data in formats that are recommended. And they should also come up with the metadata that are requested by the data repository. Next slide. The next 10 guidelines, the core of the business, are aimed at the data repositories themselves. And then you have things like they have to have an explicit mission in the area of digital archiving. They have to use due diligence to ensure compliance with legal regulations. There have to be documented and procedures, plans for long-term preservation, explicit workflows should be available. Next slide. The data repository should assume responsibility for access and availability of the digital objects. They should ensure data integrity, authenticity, and of course they should deliver the adequate technical infrastructure able to support all of these tasks and responsibilities. Next slide. The last 3 guidelines are aimed at the data consumers. They have to comply with regulations set by the data repository. They have to agree with the codes of conduct that are available, and they have to respect the applicable licenses. Next slide. So with respect to the procedures around DSA, like I said, there is an online tool available for the self-assessment and the review process. So after filling out the initial application form, the board will look for a reviewer and you can start filling out the assessment. Once the assessment is finished and submitted, the reviewer has 2 months to complete the review. And in this period of 2 months, the reviewer is in contact with the applicant and he can ask requests for clarification and ask questions to the applicant, and of course there are deadlines involved. And when this discussion is finished and there are no further issues and all guidelines meet the minimum level of compliance, then the DSA is awarded. Next slide. So a few words about the investment that you have to do as a repository in time and in money. First of all, in time, this differs very much because it depends on the level of professionality of your repository. This can vary from having all the documentation already in place and having all procedures in place and just collecting this information, or maybe a repository has part of it already in place but still needs to properly describe certain policies or processes. Or it may even be the case that you are still missing policies and have to define them, or processes, or maybe you need to build certain elements in your infrastructure. And you can imagine that then it takes quite a long time. But if you start your application the moment you think you have everything more or less in place, and it's just collecting the documentation, that it typically will take you a number of days. And with respect to the money involved, the story is much simpler. DSA is free of charges, and all the information that you need is available on the web. The guidelines, the documentation, the assessment tool, etc. Next slide. Here you see a screenshot of the starting point for obtaining the data seal of approval of the self-assessment tool. And on the right hand, you can see a part of the list of the acquired seals, which numbers now up to 22. Next slide, please. Here you see the names of the people that are in the current DSA board, and I must confess that this list of names doesn't completely match the nice picture taken in Florence last year of the board. But on the left-hand side, anyway, you can see our chair, who is Mary Vardigan, director at ICPSR in the United States. Next slide. A few words about recent developments surrounding DSA. The first development is that there is a new global initiative called the Research Data Alliance, you might have heard of, which is aimed at facilitating data sharing. And within this initiative, there is a group set up, an interest group around certification of digital repositories. And at the moment, under the umbrella of this group, we are working on a further collaboration of DSA with another basic accreditation system set up by the World Data System. Another development is that we see that within a number of emerging European research infrastructures, the DSA guidelines are being used, and usually they use DSA as the basis, and per research infrastructure then they add specific for that research infrastructure specific extra requirements. So this also gives DSA a much broader scope and outreach. Like I said, we already have 22 seals acquired, but we also have around 12, I think, at the moment, applications waiting for review. And seals have been acquired already in Europe, in the US, in South America, and also in Australia, so quite worldwide. Next slide. I would like to conclude with stressing again two very basic principles of DSA. The first one is transparency. Like I said, the documentation should preferably be available online for everyone to see. But also, when a data seal is awarded to a repository, the self-assessment of this repository is made available on the web as well on the DSA side. So we think transparency is very important. And also inclusiveness, because we think when a repository shows its users what it can and what it can't offer, that is much more important than having a closed shop. And being transparent helps very much to build the trust that we need when we make use of digital repositories. Next slide. That's my last one. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ingrid. That was a very nice talk and very clear. I already saw one question pass by over the chat about how difficult it can be to influence the format of digital born material. It was by Stefan Davis. Stefan, would you like to explain your question a little bit further? If you push on the, or click on the microphone, then we can hear you. Are you still there? Yes, I think you are. Stefan? Oh, has no mic. Well, in that case, Ingrid, I shall read out the question very literally. Stefan writes, just to note, when we receive born digital archives, we have no influence over the format in which the data is provided. How do you usually solve that in the data seal of approval?
I agree that that's quite an issue, and it's you really need to strike the right balance between this demand on the one hand, which is quite fair, I think, because you really want to have formats that you can support and which are widely used, so you know that there is a possibility for wider reuse. On the other hand, if I project this on my own institution, we have this dilemma every time, because on the one hand you want to be strict and you want to give certain guarantees that you can provide for this these digital objects also over a longer period of time. On the other hand, you don't want to miss things. So I also see at my own institution that we sometimes bargain a little bit on that issue, whether we take it in or not. So we have a list of preferred formats, but we also have very quietly somewhere in the corner also a list of accepted formats for which we give less guarantees. So the ideal situation would be to only accept preferred formats, but there can be reasons to divert from that and make it accept things that they do not completely fall within your preferred format list.
If archives do that, how in what way does that influence the fact whether they can go for the data seal of approval? Is it a matter of not having too much variety, or how is that judged?
I think with all the guidelines that we use, we have this guideline and we use common sense in that respect. And we also, what we do is, like I said, it's not all written in stone, these compliance levels. So we really try to find the right balance between what can we ask, what is reasonable now at this time, and what is the ideal situation where we want to go to. So you always have to bargain a little bit in that.
Okay, that's very clear. Let's see whether we have another question in the audience. Anybody who wants to mention something? David mentioned semantics are of course also important, not just the formats. Okay. Well, nobody seems to step up. Then I would like to thank Ingrid. This was all very clear, and I guess in the whole step approach, then this would be the first step, and that would probably make us ready for the next talk, which is Sabine Schrimps from the Deutsche Nationalbibliothek, the German National Library, where the Esther group has been working on the DIN approach for certification. I see the slides appearing again for everybody. If you click the little box fit to screen, then you'll be able to see them more clearly on your screen. And now that they're here, I'd like to give the word to Sabine. Sabine, take it away.
Thank you, Evke. So I will now spend the next 15 minutes to introduce you to the DIN standard 31644, criteria on trustworthy digital archives, and the NESWAR approach for certification that was developed on the basis of this DIN standard. Next slide. Let me start with a little history. The network catalog of criteria for trusted digital repositories was originally developed within the NESTOR project. NESTOR was a project to build up the network of expertise for digital preservation in Germany, as it still exists today. The first version was published in German and in English and in 2006, and it received a large amount of feedback, which has been incorporated in version 2. Since 2008, the catalog of criteria was taken forward within the German Institute for Standardization, and a DIN standard was developed from it. The criteria have remained basically the same. They have just been structured a little bit differently from the English version that can still be found on the NESTOR website. So the NESTOR catalog of criteria is still publicly available without a fee. The DIN standard, however, is available in German only from the DIN publishing company. So since 2012, the final DIN 31644 standard is available. Next slide, please. Oh, and comprehensive explanatory notes about the standard and the assessment are also available on the NESTOR website. Let me now quickly say something about the principle that drove the revision of the criteria. And excuse me, my telephone rings, just ignore it. The first criterion is abstraction, which means that the catalog formulates its criterion on such an abstraction level that it can be applied to a broad spectrum of digital long-term repositories, and they will remain valid over a longer period of time. Then the second principle is conformity with OEIS terminology, which means that wherever possible, the common terms and terminology of the OEIS model and concepts of the model were used and picked up. Then there are 4 principles for applying the criterion. The first is documentation, which means that the basic concepts and specifications and implementations of the digital long-term archive should be documented, of course, which allows to check whether all parts of the digital archive are fully coordinated. The principle of transparency was already stressed by Ingrid in her presentation. It is, of course, one of the most important goals of certification, and transparency is achieved by publishing appropriate parts of the documentation that is available about the digital archive. Transparency can also be restricted to a specified circle, because there will always be a certain amount of documentation available which is not suitable for the general public when it comes to company secrets or security-related information. The next principles are adequacy and measurability, where adequacy means, where the principle of adequacy is derived from the acknowledgement of the fact that no absolute standards are possible, but rather that the evaluation is based on the objectives and the tasks of the digital archive that undergoes certification. And these objectives and tasks and environments can differ from archive to archive. Measurability as the last principle refers to the fact that in some cases there are no objectively measurable features, and in such cases indicators have to be found that can at least help to measure levels of trustworthiness. Now let's look at the structure of the DIN standard. Next slide. The standard, or the part of the standard with the criteria, is structured in 3 parts, where the first part refers to the organization of the archive with 12 criteria altogether. These criteria aim at the goal of the organization, its mission, mandate, also to legal issues. The second part of the criteria refer to the management of intellectual entities and their representations, and it's altogether 12 criteria that belong to this part. The last part is very small. It's only 2 criteria that refer to infrastructure and security of the digital archive. And here in the text box on the bottom of the slide, you can see how each one of the 34 criteria is sub-structured. After the criterion in itself, a general explanation of criterion follows with a little interpretation of the criterion. Then examples are added, and literature is cited that relates to the criterion. Next slide, please. Let me continue with a couple of slides about the Nestor approach for certification that was developed within the Nestor working group on certification. The Nestor group consists of a group of approximately 8 people. The Nestor working groups are in principle open to the public, so everyone who's interested in the topic and brings along a certain amount of expertise is welcome to join the group. And this group has developed an extended standard that I have just explained to you. The assessment is based on the assumption that the fulfillment of the individual criteria as the realization of the digital archive is a multiple stage process that can be roughly divided in the steps. Let me check. That can be roughly divided in the steps conception, then planning and specification, then realization and implementation, and last, evaluation. And the degree of fulfillment can be measured according to these 4 steps. Whereas conceptions receives a measure of 0, planning and specification receives the measure 3, implementation receives the measure 6, and a full implementation that can be evaluated receives the measure 10. And the digital archive that wants to apply for the Nestor seal goes ahead and assesses all 34 criteria with the help of an audit form, which is basically an Excel spreadsheet that you see in the next slide. Next slide, yes. It is filled in German as it comes from the test audit that we had at the German National Library. You see, however, that it lists the number of the criteria, then it names the criterion, then it names the degree of fulfillment and the appropriate measure. Then the next column can be filled in with the implementation of the criterion, and the last column lists some appropriate documentation. Next slide, please. When the digital archive has filled in the assessment form, it is sent to the Nestor office, which forwards it to the Nestor working group on certification. And a reviewer is appointed who reviews the assessment form. If the review yields a positive result, then the review report is published on the Nestor website. The reviewer's evaluation republished, and all relevant and non-confidential documentation is also published. And then the digital archive is entitled to the Nestor seal for trustworthy digital archives. you can see that the Nestor seal includes the year of issue, so that yeah, the relevance of the and that way of the problem that we did not want to, where the group solved the problem that it didn't want to make it mandatory to apply for the seal every couple of years. It is principally valid indefinitely, but of course the relevance diminishes. Next slide, please. The next slide shows the complete self-assessment process, starting with the institution wishing to obtain a Nestor seal, and then the notification of Nestor and nomination of contact persons. Then Nestor confirms the start of the review and appoints a reviewer. So then both parties have designated people for the process. Then the archive conducts the self-assessment and submits it to the Nestor reviewer. The reviewer checks the plausibility of the self-assessment and any accompanying documentation, and he writes a review report. Then a second reviewer approves the review report, and if there are disputes, they are taken to the Nestor working group on certification. The entire process should not take longer than 3 months, and a smaller fee is applied. It costs 500 to undergo the certification to refund the effort of the Nestor reviewers. Next slide, please. Let me now finish my presentation with 3 slides on the DNB test audit experience against the DIN 31644. Let me start with the motivation of the DNB for seeking external assessment, even when it's only a test audit. But of course, it's the same motivation was true when the DNB applied for the data seal of approval. In both processes, both processes meant that the DNB preservation team could do a systematic review quo. It meant that the DNB could have their processes and their documentation reviewed and scrutinized, and of course ideally approved by external professionals. It meant that strengths and gaps could be determined, and of course gaps need to be determined before they can be closed. That was a big motivation. And last but not least, transparency towards the preservation community was an important motivation. On the next slide, you see the structure and the timeline of the test audit. It took a little more than half a year, and it was a mutual process where experience from the test audit could be fed back to the Nestor working group and could be taken into account while the certification process was finalized. I won't go into much more detail on this slide because I see that I am running out of time, and I have one more slide before I finish, which lists some of the lessons learned in the test audit. Overall, both the standard and the DNB stood the test. Effort needed at the DNB was approximately 1.5 person month, which included or involved several members. And the finalized assessment form was also put forward to higher management and was approved before it was taken back to the Nestor working group. A lesson learned for the certification process was that it needs to be defined and documented and transparent for the audit candidate to be doable. And this led to the publication of the explanatory notes on the Nestor seal for trustworthy digital archives, which are published on the Nestor website. Another lesson learned was that the object of the assessment must be specified precisely, and mutually independent archives of one institution can be assessed jointly or independently. In the test audit of the DNB, it led to confusion that in a project we developed a new workflow for our long-term archive, and evidence for the criterion was taken sometimes from the new project workflow and sometimes from the old operational workflow. So this showed us how important it is to specify which parts of the archive apply for certification. And this is it. I come to a close. Next slide. And I see that a couple of questions appeared in the chat box. Maybe Evge, you can guide me through them.
Yes, thank you very much, Sabine. That was also a very clear talk. There were indeed a few questions coming by. The simplest one was the costs, and I think I heard you say that the fee was 500 euros. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, it is 500 euros to refund a little bit of the effort of
Sabine,
the
are you
reviewer.
still there? Yeah.
Yes, I am. Could you hear me? I said yes, it is 500 euros.
Okay. Okay, so that goes directly to the reviewer. Okay. Then there was a question, I think, by Stefan Strodel of SBA. Sorry, yeah?
Actually, the 500 euros go to the Nestor office to support the structures of Nestor. It is like a, how do you say that? Like a gift of the members of the Nestor working group to Nestor.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. And then there was a question by Stefan Strodel whether there are minimum requirements for specific processes.
Yes, there are.
Yeah.
I said that the standard consists of 3 parts, and the first part about the organization of the digital archive, there the archive has to score the highest rate, 10 points for each of the 12 criteria. In the second and third part, an average of 7 points must be reached, which is a mixture of the highest and second highest score, or always highest and 1 or 2 times the lower score.
Okay. And then there was a question, but I think you've already answered it, about the time, the sort of the time horizon for a seal. But you said there was a year added to it. It's so a maximum validity for the seal?
No, there is not. It is in the responsibility of the archive. If it still wants to display a Nestor 2013 seal, it is already 2025. The Nestor working group decided that this speaks for itself.
Okay, very good. And then my last question would be, when would you advise an archive to go for the Nestor seal, and when would you advise them to go for the DANS seal? In what kind of stage of development should an organization be to best go for the one or for the other? Do you have any idea on that?
Instead of an advice, I would like to share an observation, and that is, Renee says DSA is not the DANS seal, it is an international community seal, of course. No, but the observation that I would like to share is that quite quite a couple of German institutions were granted the data seal of approval already, and none of those has applied for the DIN standard yet. So my observation is that the data seal of approval is a good entry point for certification, and I expect that some of the institutions that have gone through the data seal of approval will apply for the DIN sometime in the future.
Yeah, okay. I see that Ingrid would like to give a reply to that as well. Ingrid, please take the mic.
No, I would like to answer a question that was sent in a bit earlier. I'm trying to find it, by Robert Sharp, who was asking, is it only possible to use DSA if all of your repositories are on the internet? And I would like to stress that this certainly is not the case. We have the principle that we want repositories to be as open as they can, but of course, sometimes data need to be protected, and you can't put it all on the web when there are IPR issues involved or when there is personal information in the data. So open if possible, protected if necessary, and not all the repository contents need to be on the internet in order to apply for a DSA seal.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. And René van Horik just corrected me. Of course, the DSA is not the DANS seal. In fact, DANS is also going for all kind of seals, because I understood that they're one of the first who have enlisted themselves for the Nestor seal. Is that correct? So,
yeah, that's correct. That is one of our main goals of the organization next year, to acquire the Nestor seal of approval. Yeah, because we are walking the steps up towards the ISO standard. So we renewed our DSA seal, are now going for the DIN, Nestor seal, and then next year we want to try to get the ISO standard.
Yeah. Well, that is a very nice bridge and opening to our next talk by Barbara Sierman about the ISO approach for certification. That would be, as Ingrid just illustrated, the third step. And I see that Simon is putting up the slides again. Again, for everybody, if you click fit to screen, you'll see them better. And I would like to give the floor to Barbara. Barbara, are you ready for it?
I'm ready for it. Okay, well, I want to talk about auditors. Sorry. I want to talk about audit and certification from an auditor's perspective, and that's related to the work we did in APARSEN. Next slide, please. First, a bit of history. When the OAS model was first published in 2002, it was already foreseen that there needed to be a process for certification of repositories, and this was explicitly mentioned in paragraph 1.5. There needed to be standards for accreditation of archives. In those days, the research library groups in the US and the National Archive joined forces, and they created the first draft for public consultation in 2005, the checklist for certification of trusted digital repositories. They also did some test audits. RLG came, amongst others, to Portico and to the KB, the National Library of the Netherlands. And after that, some other initiatives started, like the Drambora that was published, and Nestor, as Sabine told us, had the first draft of their auditor certification documentation. And the feedback from the test audits of the checklist was finally described in the Trusted Repositories Auditor Certification Report, in that time published by OCLC and CRL, so changing organizations, and it's better known as TRAC, and it's still quite often referred to. There started another group based under the headings of the CSDS organization, which also gave organized the first version of the OAS model. And that group was the Repository Audit and Certification Group, the REC working group. And they started to have regular calls in order to make the track document first a CSTS standard and then an ISO standard. And one of the goals of this group was to create a document that could also be used as a self-assessment document for a broad variety of organizations. And it was also designed to form the basis for a full external audit process, so both a self-assessment and an external process for all types of repositories, governmental or private, managed by consortia or other institutions, and concerned with preservation of information in all variety of types, from cultural to science to commercial. And in 2012, the resulting ISO standard, the ISO 16363, Audit and Certification of Trustworthy Digital Repositories, was an official standard. Slide, please. Yes. The standard 16363 it followed the chapters in the track document, and I saw them also in the DIN standard, the organizational structure, the digital object management, and the infrastructure and security risk management. And I think that's similar with the DIN standard. The infrastructure and security risk management is a little bit smaller than the other two chapters, as there are a variety of standards related to IT and infrastructure and security risk management. So there are other ISO standards that are applicable for that. So in this chapter, it's only the elements that are related to digital preservation that are dealt with. The standard consists of what we call metrics, and I don't have an overview of the amount of metrics like DIN and DSA have. I should have counted them, but there are a lot of metrics in it. And the metrics are built up according to a certain set of ingredients. First, we have a statement of requirement, the definition of the metric. Then we have some supporting text to explain a little bit about the metric. Then we give some examples how a repository can demonstrate it's meeting the requirement, what is called evidence, as Simon already mentioned. And we have a part in what we call discussion, in which various points of views in relation to the statement are described, is to support the auditors both as well as the self-assessment organizations. Next slide, please. And to give you an example of the evolution of the documentation, you see first the track document from 2005 with a small metric, one sentence and one sentence explanation. From my previous experience, I can say it's hard for a repository to decide how to meet this requirement. We were happy in 2007 with the evidence chapter, which briefly summarizes how an organization can meet that requirement. But in ISO, we improved this, I think, with a lot more of information, background information, where you really get some extra description of how you can meet the metric and what are the points of view in relation to the metric. Next slide, please. It has been taught now a few times, mentioned a few times now, the European framework. I will briefly tell you about that. Encouraged by the European Commission, the parties involved in certification in Europe, like the Data Seal of Approval, Nestor, and the chair of the REC working group, so the CCSTS initiative, they all signed a memorandum of understanding in 2010, and in that memorandum they agreed on establishing the framework that was mentioned a few times now. the basic certification, the extended certification, and the formal certification. As you can see on the slide, the basic certification is based on the data seal of approval, and the extended and the formal certification both can be met by the DIN standard or the ISO standard. So there is a growing path of being certified. You can start small, and all your efforts that you have done will help to go to the next level of certification. Next slide, please. The relation with the APARSEN project is that we did some test audits in the APARSEN project. The audits took place in the summer of 2011. This was the first year of the APARSEN project, and at that moment the ISO standard 16363 was not yet an official standard. So we planned a few test audits to do well, basically to test the draft standards themselves. And that counted both for the ISO 16363 and the DIN standard. I won't tell you much more about the DIN standard because Sabine already told you about that. The test audit was done at the German National Library. The ISO standard was done in a variety of other organizations, and I concentrate on that part. When we tried to test the practical use of the draft standards, we had some ideas of the elements we wanted to check. First of all, were the metrics understandable and usable for the organizations? And was it for the auditors possible, or the test auditors, I must say, was it possible to have to evaluate the organization in a consistent way? Because that's what you want to achieve. You don't want to have a evaluation that differs by organization. You want to have a consistency amongst the organizations. And how much time and effort was needed for a repository to become ready for the audit procedure? And the other thing was the standard applicable on different kinds of repositories? You remember I said this was one of the goals, that the ISO standard should be applicable in a wide variety of organizations. Next slide, please. So we found a set of organizations, 6 organizations, willing to participate in the test audits. And 3 of them were in Europe, and 3 of them were in the United States. And the European repositories, they all were involved in the European framework, and they all had the data seal of approval that Ingrid told us about. So they basically they had the first level already there. And the auditors, the international group of auditors, there were people from Europe and from the United States, and they were all members of the CCSDS REC working group, so the people that wrote the standard basically. And for a large part, this group also consisted of people that were involved in the OAS standard. Some of the members were involved in the APARSEN project, like Simon and David and me. And those that were not in the APARSEN project volunteered to take part in the test audits. We were around 10 people big, and we all had years of experience in digital preservation, and we represented a variety of organizations: archive, libraries, data centers, library schools, space agencies, and university repositories. So although we were not experienced auditors, we knew what we were talking about. If you look at digital preservation. Next slide, please. Simon, can I? Oh, sorry. Sorry. The audit procedure consisted of 2 stages. First, the repository completed a self-audit template we had created based on the 16363. So there was a list that they needed to fill in, they needed to add documentation, and it was a kind of self-assessment for them, plus documentation for the audit team. And this set of information was returned to the audit team, and we prepared on the basis of this the topics we wanted to discuss and the things that we thought were missing or where we wanted to have some more information about. So we started with a large set of information from the repository without having seen the repository. So we also planned a site visit, a 2-day site visit, and we came there with many and sometimes all of the members of the audit group, which was a little bit overwhelming for them, and it doesn't reflect real-life audits, because in real-life audits you have more or less 2 or 3 persons that are visiting your organization. So we came there with a group, and we had a program organized, and after the 2 days we as an audit test audit team gave some verbal feedback with our first impressions, and a few weeks later they received a detailed report in which we described the areas for improvement. So we looked at the metrics that in our test audit opinion were not met according to the ISO 16363. And all the organizations were offered a chance to give their feedback as well, and this was reflected in the documentation. Next slide, please. And we did give feedback after the audit place and also in the written reports. And in general, and I think that still is a thing that we hear quite often, in general the organization found the testing procedure very useful. But the preparation time took them quite more time than they had expected. But sometimes they also confessed that the documentation they needed to write down for us or for the test audit procedure, well, they needed to make that anyway. So although it costed them a lot of time, it was also very helpful for their own procedures and processes. It gave them some insights in their strengths and weaknesses, which was also very helpful. And but they also had some things they want to be improved. For example, the audit procedure they wanted to have improved because they wanted to see they wanted to have a better idea of what to expect from the process and the procedures, so that they could better prepare themselves for that. And what they also would like to know, and that here the ISO standard differs from the DIN and the data seal of approval, they wanted to know how the conformity was measured. They would like to know to see a yardstick, were they yellow, green or red compared to the other repositories. And the result they got was more an overview of where they as a repository could improve themselves. And they had well, basically they had some expectations from the auditors, and they were right in their expectations. Next slide, please. I can't see it. Okay, is the next slide there? Because my computer is sleeping now.
It should be there, yes.
It's there. Oh, thanks very much. As I said, they wanted to have more information about the audit, the auditors themselves, and the auditing practices. And ISO has a range of standards related to good auditing practices. And one of the things that in ISO is organized is to appoint. How do you appoint a auditor? So after we had finished the ISO 16363, the same group started working on another standard, the ISO 16919, that is called Requirements for Bodies Providing Auditor Certification for Candidate Trustworthy Repositories. So here we talk about the auditors and how to get a group of auditors that are certified to audit organizations, so that as a certified organization you can expect consistency in the standardization. So if you receive a ISO 16363, you know that you have that you are audited by a certified auditor. So this defines a process for accreditation of the auditors. Well, it's a bit a pity. We would have liked to say to you that it was finalized, this standard, last week, but on Saturday we received some minor feedback that we need to improve in this ISO standard. So we hope in a few weeks' time the standard will be approved. And from that moment we have the ISO 16363 for the repositories and the ISO 169 for the auditors to be accredited. So the whole process is then in place, and the national standardization bodies can start appointing official auditors, and the digital repositories will be able to plan their certification according to the 16363, which currently is not officially possible. Next slide, please. You can find more information on the APARSEN website. For example, the report on the peer review of digital repositories. So the report on the repositories we audited in America and in Europe, and all the reports you can find there and the feedback. And you can find on the next URL, the ISO16363.org, news about the status of the ISO standard, references that are made, and you can also find a self-assessment template that was used during the audit for more information. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara. This was very clear again and nicely fits into the other two presentations about the self-assessments. Should we now conclude that this is sort of the heavy test in the line of 3, or what would you say?
You ask me? I would say, well, according to the framework, European framework, it is the heavy test, and it is the official international standard. So I would say yes.
Okay, okay. There, I saw a few more questions come by in the chat box. For example, Robert Sharp asks, is there any idea of how much formal accreditation will cost? Barbara.
Not by me. I have no idea because it's not started yet.
Okay. And then, of course, there are the official costs, but also the costs within the organization doing it, I guess.
Yes, yeah. Yes. But that's why the framework is so nice, because you don't start with the third level. You start with the first level, and gradually you develop yourself to be able to follow the third level, or to apply for the third level.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There was another question related to that, because previously we've identified how the 3 steps sort of follow on each other and add something. There was also a question whether there's already a systematic comparison between the 3 approaches. And I know that David's going to say something about that. Do you want to say something too?
No, I leave it to David.
Okay, that's very clear. Then there's also a question whether these PowerPoints will be available. Yes, and some of them even with audio, so you can listen to the whole talk again. And they will be available on the APARSEN website, for which David has circulated the link. So stay tuned to the APARSEN website, because we will also announce more webinars there. So if you like this one, maybe you also want to come to a next one. Okay, then I think we would be ready for our final talk, unless anybody...
Sorry, Evke, there is one question. Rob Sharp asked, sounds more expensive, and I think he means 16363 sounds more expensive. Yes, but could be, but you should also think about who is asking you to get certified. That might be, there might be a relation to your expenses you are willing to make, and the reason why you are certified. So I think you should also take that into consideration. But maybe David can tell us more about it.
Yes, that sounds like a very good bridge to David. And I see his slides are already on the screen. I repeat again that if you click Fit to Screen, the little box underneath the slides, then you can see them better. And David is ready to tell us more about how APARSEN tries to make ISO, DIN, and DSA work together. David, are you ready for it?
Yes. So my name is David Jurek. I'm the director of the Alliance for Permanent Access and the technical coordinator for APARSEN. I also led the CCSDS working group on repository audit and certification, so the 16363 work. So I am a little bit biased, but what I aim to do here is to address that bias and to show how APARSEN is trying to fit these various certification works together in answer to the question that came up earlier. So next slide, please, Simon. Most of the work that's done out there in digital preservation is or claims to be conform and consistent with the OAIS reference model that provides those fundamental concepts and fundamental definitions. And there's a quote there from an important report that came out a little while ago. Click on, please, Simon. Just one click. The point is that the OAIS standard was, that's 2 clicks. It's okay, just leave it there, Simon. The OAIS standard was written in a way that it could be, that these things could be tested. And yeah, if you go on to the next slide, please, Simon. As Barbara mentioned, OAIS came out. It's been updated in 2011. That gave rise to the track work as part of the process. We produced 16363. If you click on one more time, Simon. This is one of the problems of animation when doing mouse clicks by remote control. Well, I'll just speak to this. What this will show eventually is the those 3 levels that Barbara mentioned: the basic, extended, and formal. One more click, Simon, and the role of OAIS is quite fundamental here, both in the DIN standard and the 16363. The DSA slightly less so. I mean, one of the things you saw earlier was this focus on format rather than the OAIS term representation information, which is mentioned in the OAIS standard and includes semantics and software and so forth. Also, the OAIS based work has a strong focus on authenticity, which is valuable. Otherwise, one may be preserving things which are not what you think they are. Next slide, please, Simon. Now, you've seen also that these different standards have different numbers of metrics, if I can call them that. The DSA just around 10, the DIN around, what was it, about 30 or so, and the 16363, it depends how you count them because there are some sub-metrics, but nearer to 100. And I think no matter how many metrics there are, it is impossible to anticipate all of the possibilities. So the work that the metrics really act as a guide for the auditors. And so there is a fundamental dependence on the auditor's experience. On the one hand, on say the DSA side, and to a certain extent on the DIN side, it depends on the experience and indeed the reputation of the DSA board, and for DIN on the NEST or working group on certification. Problem is to try within each of those standards, within each of those certification frameworks, to have some guarantee of consistency of judgment, both within individual areas, within different groupings of repositories, and over time. Next slide, please, Simon. And again, in all three of the works you've heard about, it's not really a simple statement that, yes, this repository is perfect. Everybody has the view that this is certification is part of a process of improvement that needs to be monitored, and every repository, no matter how good they are, has room for some level of improvement. Next slide, please. So the key difference in many ways is who audits. ISO 16363 has the answer that it's determined by the 16909 standard that's about to be published. This fits into the overall ISO system. There's a system about that all the standards that have certification processes adhere to, and of course what one needs to ensure is these things like impartiality, competence, and so forth. So that's how 16363 fits into that broader ISO process. Next slide, please. The auditors are not envisaged to be members of particular organizations that hold repositories, but rather the organizations which right now do the ISO certification. So these range from the very large audit firms, KPMG, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and so forth, and a number of specialized auditing terms, some international, some nationally based, but all of them follow the ISO process. All of them follow the specifications of the requirements for bodies providing audit and certification, and all of them have to be accredited in the full ISO way. Next slide, please. And of course the 16363, I guess it's it's reasonable to say that it does have an assumption that there will be commercial organizations there, both ready and willing to do the audits, and also commercial private organizations that wish to be audited. And the whole process fitting within the ISO process is designed to scale up to fit a large need, should that be there, but I'll come back to that. Next slide, please. I think you can click through to this. There's a list of the competencies. This is the an extract from the 16919 almost standard, which essentially says what auditors need to know over and above the normal auditor competencies, but what they need to know about digital preservation, and there's quite a lengthy list there. So next slide, please. In terms of the DIN and the DSA, and here I may be exposing my own biases, but I think what we've heard that the auditors and the DSA are the founder members, plus I believe I'm right in saying previous auditees, while in DIN it relies on the NEST working group on certification, although I might be corrected in that in the discussion. The next slide, please. So we have a number of interesting things that we could think about here. So what would success be like if we are successful in the in these schemes of audit and certification? Well, one is adoption, and clearly there are a number of markets. There are, as has been mentioned, memory institutions, the libraries, museums and so forth. There are research institutions that have very large amounts of data, and remember the data is the new gold, quote from the European Commission. And there are commercial organizations that to a large extent rely on the intellectual capital that's captured in their data. Another criterion of success is, and maybe one that, to be truthful, will drive the adoption of certification, are probably not the people who run repositories, because I mean, I've run repositories and I would hate to have been audited by a third party of more or less strangers, but maybe that speaks more about me than about anything else. But I think the people who will be more interested in this are the funding bodies, the people who place contracts. For example, governments who place contracts with repositories often require at the moment the ISO 27000, so the security type certification. That may be true for the preservation aspects. There may ideally be legislative requirements placed on certification. There are, I believe, there's some legislation in Italy, for example, or EU directives. Next slide, please. And what will determine the success? I think it really comes down to the balance of cost against benefits. This speaks directly to to the questions that were asked a few moments ago. I think you've seen costs ranging from 0 to a few hundred to probably several thousand euros. And the question is who provides that money, and indeed who will judge the benefits, which market, if I can speak in those terms, will see the need for one or other of these types of certification. It may be, and this is certainly how it's laid out now, that there is a ladder, a step from basic to extended to formal, which we believe should be attractive, but I might imagine that, say, the commercial world will not see very much in the basic or extended, but may well want to go directly to the full ISO certification. The other thing that will determine success is the availability of materials, consultancies to help get into a fit state, and of auditors. And finally, the reputation of the certification. If, for example, an organization receives some certification and then immediately loses its data, then that might speak to the quality of the certification. So all of these things we'll see over the next few years, I think. Next slide, please, Simon. So APARSEN's role has been to help bring all of these together. You've heard about the Memorandum of Understanding. Through APARSEN, the EU has also funded test audits, so we have some idea of the amount of effort. So this is not speaking to the cost of the audit, but the effort that's needed to prepare the materials and the evidence for audits, which would range from a few days for the DSA to 1 or more months for DIN and ISO. It also helped to finalize the 16363 standard. So overall we have a menu. You've heard about the 3 types. You've heard about how they fit together. I think we have at least a little bit of evidence about the benefits that repositories see in these types of different certifications, but in the end I think it will be these markets which will judge which, or maybe which combination of audits and certifications will be suitable for them. Next slide, please. So, and I guess another interesting question is why we get into this, why we do this. I think it's probably fair to say that all of us, throughout all these different certification approaches, have a vision of building trust in digital repositories, so that there is continuous improvement to ensure that resources are spent well. That's particularly important for the people who fund repositories, that the auditors are good people one might trust in some approved scheme, and indeed I guess we also see that or hope that we will build these markets for vendors and system builders, which will help make all of our lives a lot easier. One more click, please, Simon. There's one more line on this page, and that is something which I can't read. And so this is the really the bottom line, and I think this is really what the powers that be, the politicians, would like to see. That is, society benefits from its digitally encoded intellectual capital. And I think that we see now that certainly in the EU, in Asia, and in the US, the role of some type of certification is certainly being recognized, and in some areas is very definitely recognized by those on high. And I think that's my last slide. Thanks, Simon. Just a few links.
Thank you,
they'll be available
David.
on the website.
Okay, very good. Let me see if there's any question. Is somebody with a question? Make yourself known in the chat box or turn on your mic. Either way. In the meantime, I have a question for David. As you say, the APARSEN project has made available a menu between these different seals and certifications procedures. And I was wondering, what else will APARSEN deliver in this context, either before the end of the project or maybe even beyond the project? David?
Well, I think there are a number of things that we'll see coming from APARSEN, ranging from training to services, and in terms of the Virtual Centre of Excellence, based on the experience that we have from the test audits, we'll see a number of these things, especially training, services, tools, which will help repositories, if I can put it this way, to do preservation better and to be better prepared for the different sorts of certification that they might choose to attempt to gain. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. And I also saw that Ingrid wanted to add something on the topic of consistency from the DSA perspective. Ingrid, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Eefke. David stressed in his talk the issue of consistency of judgment, and I totally agree with him. And that triggered me to say a few words on the DSA perspective on consistency. Like I said, DSA is a basic standard for certification. So also with respect to consistency of judgment, we have chosen a light way and a practical approach to this issue. And I think it's also important in this respect that DSA is aimed at really at public domain repositories. But we do think about consistency, and what we aim to do first of all is to broaden our pool of experienced peers, not only the DSA board members, but we also want to incorporate in the pool experts who went through the DSA process successfully themselves. We also aim to provide even more extensive guidance for reviewers, and we are thinking of setting up training sessions as well for the reviewers that take part in the DSA community. But again, that it becomes clear that trust also here within the international DSA community plays an important role, because you have to trust your reviewer. And I think there is a big difference with ISO, but that can be explained because ISO, I think, will have a more limited scope in the public domain, because I think that only a limited number of repositories will go and will be able to go for the ISO certification, and there is a broader group within the public domain of potential applicants for DSA, but for ISO, the potential private sector is very important as well, and then you need to have a much firmer review process as well. So within DSA, the approach is different, and I think that approach is very much based on trust within the DSA community, and also really suits the fact that DSA is a basic standard, the first step in the certification process. That was what I wanted to add.
Okay, that's a very good point. Are there any more questions from the audience? Yeah, I saw one coming by from Robert Sharp. Will we now have many auditors coming up, or how many auditors do we think there will be, and how will they be chosen? David, do you have a view on that?
Yes, I did put something in the chat. In terms of the number of auditors, I think basically it depends on the demand for audits. The ISO process does allow there to be many different organizations providing audits from the large to the small, and there is indeed an ISO process that's specified in the usual ISO way for accrediting those auditors, and we have in mind a way to work with the national accreditation bodies to do that, but it does rely on this second standard that's been mentioned, being a formal full ISO standard, which I hope will happen in the next few weeks.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that brings us to the end of this webinar. Very well attended. I saw more than 50 people at a certain point in time logged on, and even more different people, but not simultaneously. I want to ask everybody before disconnecting to enter into the chat box the organization to which you're affiliated, so that we know how many non-APARSEN people we had on this webinar. It's important for our own metrics and statistics. I'm also very happy with the active involvement of the audience, the questions you had, but of course most of all by our 5 speakers who had excellent talks, and I want to thank them all, and we hope to see you back at the next APARSEN webinar. There's a separate web page on these webinars. Stay tuned on that. You can see the next topics coming up, and hope to meet you again here. Thank you.
Thanks, Yvke. Thanks for keeping us under control.
Yes, thank you, Yvke, and bye-bye.
Bye, Yvke. Thank you.
Thank you, and speak to you later.
Thank you too.